In the small, snow-covered town of Pine Hollow, Christmas arrived with a peculiar mix of anticipation and sorrow. Nestled deep in the forests of Montana, Pine Hollow looked like a postcard brought to life, with its frosted rooftops, garlands strung across lamp posts, and wreaths hanging on every door. But behind the picturesque charm lay the weight of untold stories, burdens that the townspeople carried in their silences and sideways glances. For them, the holiday season was both a celebration and a reminder of those who were lost and wounds that never fully healed. Jonah Adler didn't celebrate Christmas anymore. Once, years ago, it had been his favorite time of year, a season of warmth and joy spent with his sister, Grace, in the family's secluded cabin at the edge of the woods. But that was before the accident. Now, Christmas was a time he dreaded, each falling snowflake a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. Jonah had been living alone in the cabin for 3 years, hiding from the world and himself. Once a promising novelist, he now stared at a blank page day after day, unable to summon the words that had once come so easily. His career had faltered, but Jonah didn't care. He told himself he deserved the emptiness. The world had taken Grace from him, and he had no intention of giving it anything in return. That morning, the snow fell in thick, lazy flurries, blanketing the yard outside Jonah's cabin. He stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and gazed at the forest beyond. The stillness was both oppressive and comforting, a silence so deep that it felt as though the world had been swallowed whole. It was then he saw the dog, sitting at the edge of the snow-covered yard. The animal looked like a ghostly figure against the white expanse. It was a scruffy thing, with patches of fur missing and eyes so sharp they seemed to cut through the cold air. Jonah squinted, trying to make out the details. The dog's coat was a mix of browns and whites, its body lean, as though it hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. But what struck him most was the scar on its ear, a jagged mark in the shape of a star. It was uncanny, as if it had been etched there with purpose. The dog didn't move, only stared at Jonah with an unnerving stillness. Jonah frowned and set his mug down on the porch railing. "Go on, get out of here," he called, his voice gruff and impatient. He waved his hand, but the dog didn't flinch. Jonah tried again. "Shoo, you're not staying here." The dog cocked its head, as if considering his words, and then, with a deliberate slowness, took a few steps forward. Jonah's annoyance grew. The last thing he needed was a stray hanging around, complicating his already chaotic thoughts. "Suit yourself," Jonah muttered, turning back toward the door. "But don't expect me to feed you." The dog didn't follow him. When Jonah glanced out the window an hour later, the creature was still there, curled up in the snow like it had decided this was home. Over the next few days, the dog became a fixture. Jonah tried everything to scare it off, banging pots, stomping through the snow, even tossing a few pebbles in its direction, but nothing worked. The dog simply stared at him with those piercing eyes, unbothered, as though it knew something Jonah didn't. On the 4th day, Jonah gave up. "Fine," he said, standing on the porch with his arms crossed. "Stay if you want. Just don't expect me to take care of you." The dog wagged its tail once, a slow, deliberate motion, as if accepting Jonah's reluctant truce. From that moment, it began following him around the property, always keeping its distance but never straying too far. Jonah found himself begrudgingly acknowledging its presence, muttering comments under his breath that the dog, of course, couldn't understand. But it felt oddly comforting to have something living nearby, even if Jonah wouldn't admit it to himself. It wasn't until the following week that the dog truly disrupted Jonah's solitude. One frigid morning, while Jonah was stacking firewood in the yard, the dog began digging furiously in the snow near the old pine tree. Jonah watched out of the corner of his eye, curiosity piqued despite himself. The dog's movements were frantic, purposeful, as though it were searching for something buried beneath the ice. "What are you doing now?" Jonah muttered, walking over. The dog paused for a moment, glanced at him, and then resumed digging. When Jonah finally reached the spot, he crouched down to see what the dog had uncovered. His breath caught as he brushed the snow away, revealing a small, tarnished object, a pendant of some kind, attached to a delicate chain. Jonah picked it up, wiping away the frost. It was a simple oval medal, engraved with a phone number that looked decades old. Where did this come from? Jonah asked aloud, though he didn't expect an answer. The dog sat back on its haunches, staring at him intently, as if waiting for him to do something. Jonah turned the medal over in his hand, unease prickling the back of his neck. Against his better judgment, Jonah brought the pendant inside. He sat at the kitchen table, the dog watching him through the window, and stared at the engraved numbers. Something about the object unsettled him, as though it didn't belong in the frozen ground. Or maybe it didn't belong in this world at all. Hours later, after pacing the cabin in restless thought, Jonah picked up his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before an elderly voice answered, crackling with static. "You found it," the voice said, without waiting for Jonah to speak. The first clue. Jonah froze, the weight of the words sinking in. He glanced out the window. The dog was gone. The voice on the other end of the phone haunted Jonah long after the call ended. It had been brief, just a few cryptic words before the line went dead, but it left an unsettling imprint. You found it. The first clue. Nothing else. No explanation, no opportunity for questions. The old-fashioned phone number on the pendant had led to an enigma, and Jonah didn't know whether to ignore it or let his curiosity lead him further. He tried to shake it off. The dog had disappeared after the call, and Jonah told himself it was for the best. Good riddance, he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Something about the dog had gotten under his skin, as though its persistent presence had awakened a dormant part of him, a part he'd spent years burying under layers of guilt and grief. But Dash returned the next morning, his brown and white fur dusted with fresh snow. He scratched at the cabin door until Jonah finally opened it, scowling down at the animal. You again? What? Are you here to drop another mystery in my lap? Jonah crossed his arms, but Dash simply wagged his tail in that deliberate, knowing way of his, like he was waiting for Jonah to catch up to whatever plan the dog seemed to have. Jonah sighed and let the dog follow him into the yard. He spent the better part of the morning chopping wood, but his mind kept drifting back to the pendant, the voice on the phone, and the strange way Dash had unearthed it. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was happening, something that defied logic. And, as much as Jonah hated to admit it, he was beginning to feel the pull of it. By the afternoon, Jonah had convinced himself to investigate. He grabbed the pendant and drove into town, his truck groaning as it navigated the icy roads. Pine Hollow looked as it always did in December, quiet, pristine, and heavy with an air of nostalgia. But today, Jonah saw it differently. Every corner of the town seemed to hold a secret. Every familiar face seemed to hide something. Even the Christmas decorations, which once brought him comfort, now felt ominous. His first stop was the library. It was housed in a century-old building, its creaking floors and musty smell a reminder of how little had changed in Pine Hollow over the years. Jonah approached the librarian, Eloise Harper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a mind like a steel trap. Eloise, Jonah began, placing the pendant on the counter. Ever seen anything like this? Eloise adjusted her glasses and peered at the object. Well, isn't this curious? She murmured, turning it over in her hands. Where'd you find it? In my yard, Jonah replied, omitting Dash's involvement. Any idea how old it is? Eloise pursed her lips. Looks handmade. Early 20th century, I'd say. The number, well, that's a relic. We haven't used a format like this in decades. Does it mean anything to you? She studied it a moment longer before shaking her head. Not directly, but I know someone who might have answers. She handed the pendant back to Jonah and scribbled an address on a slip of paper. Try Ruth Holden. She's our local historian, knows more about Pine Hollow's past than anyone alive. If this pendant has a story, she'll know it. Jonah thanked her and left, his thoughts racing. The address Eloise had given him led to a small, weathered house on the edge of town. Ruth Holden greeted him at the door, her frail frame wrapped in layers of wool. She invited him inside, and Jonah quickly realized her house was more archive than home. Every surface was covered in books, photographs, and documents chronicling the history of Pine Hollow. When Jonah showed her the pendant, Ruth's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, something like recognition. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "In my yard," Jonah repeated, uneasy under her intense gaze. "Why? What is it?" Ruth leaned back in her chair, clutching the pendant. "This belonged to a child," she said finally. "One of the missing." Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. "Missing?" Ruth nodded gravely. In the 1940s, several children disappeared in Pine Hollow, always on Christmas Eve. The town searched for years, but they were never found. The only clue left behind was this pendant. It belonged to a girl named Lily Cartwright. She was the first to vanish. Jonah sat back, his mind reeling. The pendant wasn't just a trinket. It was a piece of a decades-old tragedy. And yet, somehow, it had ended up buried in his yard, unearthed by a stray dog. "Why would it be at my cabin?" Jonah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Your family's land. It was part of the original search area. It's possible someone left it there, maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. But why it's resurfaced now?" She trailed off, her expression darkening. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Jonah left Ruth's house with more questions than answers. Dash was waiting for him when he returned to the cabin, sitting in the snow with that same watchful intensity. Jonah crouched down to meet the dog's gaze. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "You brought me that pendant for a reason." Dash tilted his head, his tail thumping against the snow. Jonah sighed and sat on the porch, the pendant dangling from his fingers. He didn't know what to make of any of it. The phone call, the missing children, the strange connection to his family's land. All he knew was that he was in too deep to turn back now. The next morning, Jonah found something else waiting for him. Dash had unearthed another item, this time near the edge of the woods. It was a torn piece of fabric, faded and frayed, but unmistakably part of a child's dress. Jonah felt the weight of it in his hands, the mystery growing heavier with each discovery. He spent the rest of the day piecing together what little he knew, poring over old newspapers and town records. The missing children weren't just a tragedy, they were part of a pattern. Every 20 years, Pine Hollow suffered a loss on Christmas Eve, as if the town itself were cursed. And now, Jonah's cabin seemed to be at the center of it all. As the sun set, Jonah stared out at the forest, the pendant and the fabric laid out on the table beside him. Dash lay curled up by the fire, his breathing slow and steady. Jonah's mind was a storm of thoughts, but one thing was clear. The dog hadn't just come into his life by chance. Dash was leading him somewhere, pulling him into a mystery that stretched far beyond his own grief. And as much as Jonah wanted to resist, he couldn't ignore the feeling that the answers he sought weren't just for the missing children. They were for him, too. By the third week of December, Jonah Adler's life had turned into something out of his unwritten novels, a story that defied logic but demanded resolution. Dash, the scrappy stray dog who had inexplicably adopted him, continued to unearth fragments of a forgotten past. The pendant, the fabric, and now an old wooden figurine carved with intricate patterns that Jonah didn't recognize. Each discovery added to the growing mystery of the missing children of Pine Hollow, pulling Jonah deeper into a history he had no desire to explore but couldn't ignore. The figurine had been buried beneath the roots of a pine tree near the cabin's edge. Jonah stared at it under the dim light of his kitchen lamp, tracing the carved patterns with his fingers. They seemed purposeful, almost ritualistic, but they offered no immediate answers. Dash sat by his feet, his head resting on his paws, watching Jonah intently. "You're not going to let me rest until I figure this out, are you?" Jonah muttered. Dash thumped his tail once in reply, and Jonah couldn't help but let out a small chuckle, despite the weight of the situation. The following day, Jonah decided to visit Ruth Holden again, hoping the town historian could shed some light on the figurine. When he arrived at her cluttered home, she examined the object with the same reverence she'd shown the pendant. "This is old," Ruth murmured, her gnarled fingers running over the carvings. "Very old. These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're protective." "Protective?" Jonah asked, his brow furrowing. Ruth nodded. Back in the early days of Pine Hollow, the settlers believed in certain traditions. They carved symbols like these to ward off evil spirits, to protect their homes and families. But this figurine, it's strange. It looks like it was meant to be buried. Jonah leaned forward. Why would someone bury something meant to protect them? Ruth hesitated, her expression turning grim. Because sometimes, the things we're trying to protect ourselves from aren't outside. They're already here. Jonah felt a chill run through him, but Ruth continued. There's a story, a legend, really. They say Pine Hollow was founded on land that was different, special. But with that came a cost. Every generation, a sacrifice had to be made to maintain the balance. Some people dismissed it as folklore, but after the disappearances started, well, she trailed off, shaking her head. The weight of her words settled over Jonah like a heavy snowfall. He left Ruth's house with more questions than answers, the figurine clutched tightly in his hand. The idea of sacrifices, protective symbols, and buried objects made his skin crawl. It was too much, too bizarre. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it all connected to his family's cabin. That night, Jonah's sleep was restless. His dreams were vivid and chaotic, filled with flashes of snow, shadows in the woods, and the sound of children's laughter that turned into screams. When he woke up, heart pounding, he found Dash sitting at the foot of his bed, watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. It was as if the dog had been waiting for him to wake up. Jonah rubbed his face, trying to shake off the remnants of the dream. "What now, Dash?" he muttered. But Dash didn't move. Instead, he stood and padded to the front door, whining softly. Jonah sighed and pulled on his boots and coat, following Dash into the cold night. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground as Dash led him to the edge of the woods. Jonah's breath clouded the air as he trudged after the dog, his unease growing with each step. Dash stopped at a cluster of trees, his nose to the ground. Jonah knelt beside him and began brushing away the snow. His hands hit something solid, a box, weathered and cracked with age. Jonah pulled it free, his fingers numb from the cold, and pried it open. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs, a journal, and a rusted key. The photographs were faded, but Jonah could make out the faces of children, smiling, happy, frozen in time. His stomach twisted as he flipped through them, recognizing some of the missing children Ruth had described. The journal was written in a delicate, looping script that Jonah didn't recognize, but one word caught his eye, repeated over and over. Grace. Jonah's breath caught. His sister's name. But this journal was decades old, belonging to someone he'd never met. What connection could it possibly have to Grace? The next morning, Jonah returned to Ruth, bringing the box with him. Ruth's face darkened as she examined its contents. This journal belonged to Lily Cartwright's mother, she said, her voice trembling. She kept it after Lily disappeared. But how it ended up here? I can't say. Jonah's mind raced. He flipped through the journal again, scanning the pages. There were descriptions of dreams, of visions of children standing in the snow, calling out for help, and always the name Grace appeared, as though it were a beacon or a plea. What does it mean? Jonah asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Why would this mention my sister? She wasn't even alive when these children went missing. Ruth shook her head. I don't know, Jonah, but there's something tying your family to this. Something that's been waiting to be uncovered. Jonah left Ruth's house feeling the weight of an invisible hand pressing down on him. That night, he sat by the fire with Dash curled at his feet, the journal open on his lap. He couldn't stop thinking about the children in the photographs, their faces so full of life, now lost to history. And Grace, her name echoing through a story that didn't seem to belong to her. As the clock struck midnight, Jonah heard a sound outside, a faint, echoing laughter that sent a shiver down his spine. He opened the door and stepped into the freezing air, scanning the woods. There was nothing there, only the stillness of the snow and the distant rustling of branches. But when he turned back to the cabin, he saw it. A figure stood in the yard, barely visible in the moonlight. It was a girl, her dress torn and her eyes wide with fear. Jonah's heart leapt into his throat as he stepped closer, but before he could reach her, she vanished, dissolving into the night like a wisp of smoke. Dash barked, breaking the silence, and Jonah felt his resolve harden. Whatever was happening in Pine Hollow, it was far from over. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Jonah couldn't deny it any longer. He was at the center of it all. The sacrifices, the children, the pendant, and now Grace. It was all connected, and Jonah knew that the answers he sought wouldn't come without a price. The days leading up to Christmas Eve brought a heavy stillness to Pine Hollow, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Jonah Adler had spent the last week unraveling a mystery that defied explanation, one that seemed determined to tie his past to the town's darkest secrets. The missing children, the eerie discoveries near his cabin, and Dash, the stray dog who had guided him every step of the way, were threads of a story Jonah couldn't yet comprehend. But he knew the answers were close, and with each passing day, the weight of it pressed heavier on his chest. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Jonah awoke to find Dash sitting by the door, tail wagging slowly, his body taut with purpose. The dog's eyes met his, and Jonah felt a jolt of understanding. Today was the day. Whatever answers awaited him, they would come now, ready or not. Jonah dressed quickly and packed the discoveries he'd collected over the past weeks: the pendant, the fabric, the carved figurine, and the photographs. He tucked the journal under his arm, the word Grace etched into his mind like a brand. Dash led him out into the snow, the morning light soft and muted. The dog's path was deliberate, taking Jonah deeper into the woods than he had ever ventured before. The trees grew denser, their branches sagging under the weight of fresh snow. Jonah's breath clouded the air, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. But he didn't hesitate. Dash's unwavering determination kept him moving forward. After nearly an hour, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood the remnants of an old stone well, its edges crumbled and moss-covered. Jonah froze, his heart pounding. The sight of it sent a wave of unease through him, as though he'd seen it before, though he couldn't recall when. Dash approached the well and sat beside it, his eyes fixed on Jonah. "What is this place?" Jonah murmured, stepping closer. He peered into the well, but the darkness inside revealed nothing. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the clearing itself were alive. The journal in Jonah's hands seemed to hum with an energy of its own. He flipped to the last page, where he found a drawing of the well, sketched in delicate detail. Beneath it were the words, "Here lies the truth." Jonah's breath caught. His hands trembled as he reached for the pendant in his pocket. The rusted key attached to it glinted faintly in the pale light. Without fully understanding why, Jonah lowered himself to the edge of the well and searched for a lock. His fingers brushed against metal, and he found it, a hidden compartment embedded in the stone. The key fit perfectly. With a click, a section of the well shifted, revealing a narrow opening. Jonah hesitated for a moment, then reached inside. His hand closed around something cold and solid. He pulled it out, a small box, wrapped tightly in weathered cloth. Jonah's pulse quickened as he unwrapped it, revealing a stack of letters and a photograph. The photograph made his knees buckle. It was Grace, standing in the snow outside the cabin. She couldn't have been older than 10, her smile wide and carefree. But it wasn't the photo that stunned him. It was the date scrawled on the back, December 24th, 1943. "That's impossible," Jonah whispered, his voice cracking. Grace had been born decades after that. Yet there she was, unmistakably his sister, captured in a moment that predated her birth. The letters told an even stranger story. They were written by Lily Cartwright's mother, addressed to someone only identified as G. The letters spoke of a bond between the two families, of promises made and debts owed. One line sent a chill down Jonah's spine. "Our children are the key to preserving the balance. Without them, Pine Hollow will fall." Jonah stood frozen, the weight of the revelation crushing him. His sister had been part of this story long before she was born. The connection between Grace and the missing children wasn't just coincidence. It was something far older, something Jonah couldn't yet fully grasp. But before he could make sense of it, a sound broke through his thoughts. It was faint at first, a child's laughter, carried on the wind. Jonah's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the clearing. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Then he saw them. Children, dozens of them, emerged from the woods, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a strange, ethereal glow. They moved silently, their footsteps leaving no trace in the snow. Jonah's chest tightened as he recognized them from the photographs. These were the missing children of Pine Hollow. Dash barked, snapping Jonah out of his daze. The dog stood protectively in front of Jonah, his fur bristling. The children formed a circle around the well, their gazes fixed on Jonah with an intensity that made his skin crawl. One of the children stepped forward, a girl in a tattered dress. It was the same girl Jonah had seen outside his cabin. She pointed at the photograph in Jonah's hand and then at the well. "They're waiting," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "It's time." Jonah didn't understand, but he felt compelled to act. He held up the photograph of Grace. "What does this mean? Why is she in this picture?" The girl's expression softened. "She saved us once," she said, "but now it's your turn." Before Jonah could ask what she meant, the ground beneath the well began to tremble. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, and the well began to glow with an otherworldly light. The children stepped back, their faces calm but expectant. Jonah stumbled, his mind racing. Dash barked again, this time with urgency. The dog nudged Jonah toward the well, his eyes pleading. Jonah hesitated, fear gripping him. But as the light from the well grew brighter, a warmth spread through him, washing away the cold and the fear. He understood, in some inexplicable way, that this was the moment everything had been leading to. With a deep breath, Jonah stepped forward and placed the photograph and letters into the well. The light enveloped them, and for a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, the clearing erupted in a blinding flash, and Jonah was thrown backward into the snow. When he opened his eyes, the children were gone. The well was dark and silent, its secrets buried once more. Dash lay beside him, his breathing shallow. Jonah's heart clenched as he reached for the dog, cradling him in his arms. "You did it, didn't you?" Jonah whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You brought me here to finish what she started." Dash's tail wagged weakly, and then he went still. Jonah sat in the snow for what felt like hours, holding the dog that had changed his life. When he finally stood, he felt different, lighter, as though a part of the weight he'd carried for years had been lifted. He looked around the clearing, now empty and peaceful, and knew that whatever darkness had plagued Pine Hollow was gone. Back at the cabin, Jonah found something waiting for him. A small puppy sat on the porch, its fur patchy and its eyes filled with curiosity. It had the same star-shaped scar on its ear. Jonah knelt down, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Dash," he said softly, "I guess your work isn't done after all." Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.